Yeah, very good afternoon, one and all present here. Myself, Dr. Nagamani, Coordinator of Vertical 1, DDH 2020. On behalf of Drug Discovery Hackathon 2020 Training Committee Chairman, Dr. G.N. Sastry, once again, I welcome you all for the Vertical 1 session. Today, in the Vertical 1, lecture will be delivered by Professor Andrew Lynn. Professor Andrew Lynn completed his PhD in Jawaharlal Nehru University in the year of 1998, and currently he is working as a professor and dean in School of Computational and Integrative Sciences, and he is in charge of professor and dean since 2016. His group is mainly working on developing methods and algorithms, especially to improve the docking scores, and also this group mainly involved in chemoinformatics using data mining methods and simulation of macromolecules. The group is also actively involved in QSAR lead open source drug discovery projects, especially by providing technical infrastructure. With this small introduction, I welcome Vertical 1 speaker, Professor Andrew Lynn, to deliver the talk on workflow for drug discovery introduction. Sir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Nagamani. I will share my screen and we will then, I will probably not be able to see you after this.
Yes.
Okay, is everything all right? Can we start?
Sir, we are not able to see your screen still.
Can you see it now or no? Okay, 1 minute. Let me start once again.
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes, sir. Perfect.
Okay, fine. All right, let's get started. First of all, a slight correction on the introduction. I'm not the dean of our school any longer. We do this by rotation. So I'm still a professor in the school. But secondly, what is the scope of my talk? We will be talking about workflows for drug discovery. So it's really speaking not so much on the scientific aspects, but how we are going to use simple scripting to be able to knit together existing tools to be able to get a pipeline or a workflow to meet our specific goals. Okay, so today's talk is the introduction. Based on what we will discuss today, we will develop this either as a practical or maybe as another lecture that can come on at a later part of the series of talks. So I'm at the School of Computational and Integrative Sciences at JNU. And just as Dr. Nagamani, Dr. Papri Banerjee, Dr. Himanshi, and Lijo at the other side are dealing with it, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Smriti Mishra and Deepak Bharti for developing much of the workflows that I'll be talking about today. Okay, so first of all, let's get started with understanding what we are doing and in the perspective of drug discovery. So when we're looking at a drug, let's take them in consideration from three particular points of view. The first is a target-based approach. The second is a ligand-based approach. And if we want to draw them from natural products, we have a third source, which is from natural products. So each of these has a different pipeline that we would start working with. So now the target-based approach, essentially you would choose a target from either the host or a pathogen. The structure should be known, and then we implement a protocol called virtual screening to define hits. So these are small molecules which are tentative inhibitors of the target, and we will get proteins with hits. Now this is an experimental protocol as well. If you develop the X-ray structure of this molecule and you can co-crystallize molecules that are inhibitors with this, we want to develop this with virtual using a computer. So it's called virtual screening. So what is this kind of protocol? Virtual screening, first of all, you need to start with the structure. And if you don't know the structure, you have a homology model of the identified targets. And then you go around and pick up a diversity library of available compounds. And this can be in the range of millions of molecules. Now, this is to define the scope of the research problem. You have an identified target, and you have a large number of small molecules, each of which you're going to fit against and see whether they are tentative inhibitors. Now, we have to develop custom scripts to be able to run these, and we pre-process them. And after this, we get some results. Now, beyond this result is also the necessity to be able to write small programs, one of which is that if you're using multiple docking programs, how do we get a consensus scoring scheme? And we might want to also develop novel methods, such as the one that I'm going to talk about, in this case, MM-PBSA, for rescoring selected candidates. Okay. Now see, this is a generic protocol. When we're talking about virtual screening, in the case of the drug discovery hackathon, you might be provided with some particular tools. You might also want to use tools that are not provided for, and you want to install them. So these we'll have to deal with, and we'll have to knit them together. And that is what we'll be dealing with as part of this protocol. So let's go back. We've got one protocol, which is from the target, virtual screening, and the hit. Now, this is standard, and most of you, because you're here for drug discovery, would know about virtual screening. So also would you know about the second, which is ligand-based. In this case, you use standard QSAR. You could use more modern methods of machine learning. In this case, we'll call them ensemble classification to define hits. So what is a hit over here? A hit is what we are predicting from our computational methods from a set of ligands or a diversity small molecule database, a set of molecules which we predict are going to be tentative inhibitors against a structure or against some particular function or pathogen. Now, this is still a prediction. So under normal circumstances, if you try saying, this is my predicted hit, you would land up with a referee who tells you that you have to validate this hit. So validation is done through an assay. A typical protocol that we use is you take your small molecule library, you define descriptor calculations, you have multiple training and test sets, you generate models, and then you can do ensemble classification, and then we predict the activity from a set of molecules whose activity is unknown. Now see, I'm deliberately putting together these as protocols because essentially what we'd like to do is write out small scripts that can run these and run them as a script for our particular purpose of running activity prediction. So with our hits, we need assays. Now assays are of two types. The first is that you take a rapid whole cell based assay, which means that you can take this molecule, test it against the whole cell and see whether it inhibits the growth or not. So this is again high throughput screening. The second is that you take a target based approach. Here you clone and express the protein. So if you have your target, you clone and express the target. Again, you have a functional assay where the hit is used to inhibit that functional assay, high throughput screening because you have a large number of hits. And now you get from these hits, you get validated hits. These are also called leads. Now, I will spend about a minute, although it's beyond the scope of what we are doing with computational work, in defining this particular structure of your entire protocol. We are really involved with predicting hits, but a predicted hit is only a prediction until you can get a hit to lead pathway, which involves an interaction with laboratories. For these assays, you need proteins. Proteins need genes. Sometimes you need the strains if you're dealing with pathogenic organisms. You also, because you're dealing now with actual experiments, you no longer just deal with the STF file. You want to have a whole library of small molecules. Now, these little clouds in blue now convert this into an experimental assay, and you need to have high facilities for doing this, or facilities which require laboratories. Sometimes with strains which are pathogens, you need to have BSL-3 facilities, other facilities which are normally beyond the scope of what you can do in a college or even in a university like what we are dealing with. So when we are dealing with an entire pipeline, what we want is to design an interface where the predictions are driven forward through a validation process, which may be automated almost like an outsourced manner. However, this is not the end of it. A validated hit is called a lead. And you can also, the third point is the natural products. I'll quickly go through this. In general, what we do with the natural products is that you have an extraction and purification pipeline. And again, they come into this. Ligands and natural products, you can normally have a diversity data set, which is a subset of the overall chemical space, and they are dealt with in the same manner. So we have validated hits. Beyond validated hits, you also have the scope of doing what we call preclinical work. Now, in preclinical work, the lead is you have to check purity, the identity check. You have to also see whether the structure is correct. Then there are standard assays, the in vitro efficacy, the in vitro selectivity, log P, toxicology, the chemical optimization potential. There are others also, in vitro kinetics, extended selectivity. These are in vitro toxicology, analog synthesis, and these are aspects required, such as from the physical chemistry, proof of principles. Now, I've just listed out all these from a typical experimental preclinical pathway to move from a lead validation. Okay. Now, this lead validation I've listed out because for the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of computational methods, especially with reference to toxicology, have reduced the failure rate from lead optimization or lead validation by up to 40%. And a huge amount of the cost involved is actually at this stage. So if we can reduce or discard failure drugs by improving methods over here or developing methods over here to replace the experimental tests, there would be a lot of scope for doing this. There's also a requirement, because these are experimental, to learn about synthesis. Now, this is important because very often we are going to rationally design drugs, and they are not necessarily existing chemicals. And being able to synthesize them or resynthesize them is also now becoming a computational problem. So what is the scope of where we are? Overall, we are just at this stage. We are dealing with virtual screening, QSAR, and we want to get hits. But for our hit to move towards a drug, there's still a long enough pathway that we need to focus on. Okay, so let's now move towards the first phase. The first phase is that if we are dealing with virtual screening, what is our typical protocol? So now a typical protocol in a laboratory, I repeat what I just said a few minutes ago. So you first of all need the structure. Then you need to define the small molecule data set. Then you need a method to be able to screen these. And after that, you need a post-processing. So I'm going to define this into pre-processing and post-processing of your docking results. So these docked ligands is what we're going to use as a black box. So docking, you have a choice, a large number of methods. Essentially what you have is a method that predicts the ligand conformation and the orientation or the pose within a targeted binding site. So you have your protein, you have your small molecule, and it docks in. Now this is a slide which is more involved. I will not read it out, but essentially the reason I'm putting it in is that I'm going to use a method that has extensive physical chemistry, which deals with entropy, enthalpy, and the delta G, which is the free energy of binding. So I'm just going to leave you with a few points from this slide. You have a protein, you have the ligand, and you have it docking. What are the measures of accuracy that we are looking at? Now, right over here, I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, so I'm going to repeat it where my cursor is. You have parameters which are steric, electrostatic, things involving with hydrogen bonding, the inhibitor strain, if it is a flexible molecule, and the enzyme strain will determine how well your prediction accuracy is. Now, when you're considering an additional factor involving equilibrium, you have the following factors also: desolvation, rotational entropy, and translational entropy. Now, the reason I'm putting this in is that early docking methods did not deal with the desolvation, rotational entropy, and translational entropy. And the question is, does it improve results or does it not improve results? Because these are costly methods computationally to think of. Okay, now let's just get back to docking. Now you have a number of methods, and we have 4 parameters that we need to look at for docking. The first is ligand flexibility, and they can be multiple. So these are some of the tools that are routinely available. There would be a number of them, so these are just representative. So you have methods that are searched are largely stochastic or random. For instance, Autodoc has a Monte Carlo. It also has a genetic algorithm-based methods. You have incremental systematic-based methods, not systemic. And then you have free energy and force field-based methods based on simulations. Okay, you'll note that sometimes like DOC has both, GLIDE has both. You have multiple methods of dealing with them. So this is just this way of sorting it depends on what you're dealing with. Now you have ligand flexibility, so methods to deal with ligand flexibility. You also have protein flexibility. Now, most of the docking methods do not allow protein flexibility because it's extremely costly. But you do have ways in which you can get protein flexibility, especially if the active site using rotamer libraries, very commonly available. The next is the availability of methods of scoring. Scoring, you have force field-based scoring, empirical scoring functions, knowledge-based scoring functions, and consensus scoring functions. Now, I'm listing out all this because these are like a menu. If you're going to write out a code and you want to, in a competition, say that, okay, let's try force field-based scoring. And you run force field-based scoring. And then you'd like to use a different based method, let's say consensus scoring. And you want to compare the results because you want to show which one is better. Now, your code or the program that you're writing should be able to run this with an option of force field based and run your protocol again with an option of consensus scoring. So the first listing that we need is what are the functions or what are the programs that we have to put together into our workflow. Lastly, you have docking assessment, which means that when you're trying to submit this, what is the accuracy that you're looking at? Now, the docking accuracy calculation, the one that I'm going to look at is enrichment factor. But I'm sure that people who are dealing with virtual screening will give you a lot more. For instance, there is the standard ROC, there is the area under the curve, there is the modified area under the curve, there is something called bedrock, RIE, which are specific for virtual screening. So just for the proof of concept that I'm showing you, I'll deal with the enrichment factor, which we'll come to or describe in the course of this presentation. So what am I going to use? Now, let's see that in my laboratory, I have access to open source software, that is Autodoc, Autodoc Vina, there's Doc6. I also have access to 2 excellent commercial software, Gold and Glide. Now, for this drug discovery hackathon, we have access to Glide, which is actually one of the best software available on it. So now let's see that in a competition, we run Glide using the standard parameters. Since everyone has access to it, everyone will use Glide. Now I want to improve my scores, so I also am going to use a docking with some of the other tools as well. Okay, so I'm going back a little bit to describe virtual screening. This may be boring for some of you, but we'll finish in about 5 minutes. What is virtual screening? We are screening databases of real or virtual molecules for potential lead compounds using computational methods. So this is actually a structure-based docking. There is the alternative that we are not using in this case, which is pharmacophore-based screen, where you just use the pharmacophore of known ligands. Now, this requires the structure of the target. You require the database of small molecules, and you need a method to dock and score bound small molecules. Now, I gave you a menu. You have the structure of the target, which would be defined by most of the problem statements. You have a database of small molecules, which could be defined by the problem statements or may not be defined by the problem statements. And you have a method of dock, which you would like to choose and score the bound small molecules, because that's part of your competition. Now, why do you do virtual screening? Now, this is relatively inexpensive because there are no material expenses of a laboratory that are required, but it is computationally expensive because sometimes you need access to high performance computers, you need access to computational time. So we are replacing the high investment of actual laboratory-based high throughput screening, but the results are not really as good as we'd like to. So we are constantly looking at improving methods. So one of the problems is that most of the high throughput screening in the past were based on libraries which were restricted to combinatorial products, and this sometimes didn't work that well. Now there's a lot more that's happened in the last 5 years. For instance, we are using ligands that are sourced from the fragments. We have small molecules, we have specific libraries that are specific to a particular class of proteins. So this is improving a lot. And combinatorial products are now on their way out, but they're still useful to be able to improve the lead optimization phase. So it's routinely used to complement HTS, but now it's becoming a class of its own. So I'm going to add to this, we need large computational resources. Now, as part of this drug discovery hackathon, this was understood, and the country's leading computational resource manager, which is CDAC, have put forward the national supercomputing facilities for its use. So we don't have to worry about the large computational resources any longer for the drug discovery hackathon, but sometimes you may have to worry about them if you're trying to do it on your own. And these three we have to define otherwise, okay? So let's see. Now, if I'm choosing from a docking software, I've already given you a listing of a few of them, and this is a listing of another few. Now you could take Autodoc. There are a number of commercial ones that we'd also like to look at. Doc. Now, if I'm using Autodoc, this is my protocol. I need to get the X-ray structure. For the X-ray structure, I need to first define the active site, the center of the active site, and after that, for accuracy, I want to add hydrogen and partial charges because my X-ray structure, when it's provided to me, is provided without any hydrogens or charges. It's in the PDB format. I also would like to solvate the entire system because solvation provides more accuracy. Then Autodoc uses a grid rather than all atoms. So a grid parameter file is created. You can adjust the grid size, and then you run the Autodoc to prepare the receptor. Now, once the receptor is prepared, this is what we would probably look like. This is for the HIV protease as an example. You have the active site clearly defined, and the programs that I used will only define the area around the active site. Now, this is all that we are interested in. The rest of the molecule is not so much of importance with reference to grid-based docking, so we can improve on the speed. Because we're using a grid, essentially it's like converting a all atom base into a sheet of continuous function points. And this is the active site now. It's like throwing a sheet over this particular shape, and each of the shape points will have charges that we can allocate to it. So this uses grid-based methods for the docking. That's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about. I'm only talking about the procedure. So you take your protein, you identify the active site, and we've got the grid put in place. Done only once. Now for the ligands, my library of small molecules has to also be processed. I'm going to use a software called Babel, and then I'm going to transform this ligand to the active site, which is the center of the macromolecule, add torsions, and then I create a docking parameter file, and this is specific for Autodoc. Now, when we are running this in a laboratory, we create an equivalent high throughput system. For instance, if I have access to 120 computers in my school and everyone goes home in the night and their computers are all available, I can put them all together and I can use all 120 computers using the software called Condo. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this to you is that the computer that will be provided to you will also have something called a scheduler. So if I have 1,000 small molecules that need to be docked, at the end of this process, I will have 1,000 different jobs, and 1,000 different jobs will be scheduled to run on the high performance facility by CDAC using their scheduler, and we'll have to modify our code, or they will modify it for this use. So this is the protocol that we have, and these are the results. I'll come back to the protocol towards the end because this is the introduction we have to get together. So if I was using a natural molecule, which is in this case, the known ligand is shown in red, and we match it against the pharmacophore, we can evaluate how well our ligand would be from various contact points. I mentioned some of them: steric, electrostatic, hydrogen bonding, etc., etc. Okay, and they fit in very nicely into our molecule. And in general, what we have is from our entire database, we have, if we just show the energy of the plot, we have more or less a normal distribution. Some of these molecules are predicted to be tight binding. Some of these are predicted to be very low binding. Most of them would be more or less in the normal binding range. Now, this is a typical docking experiment. You should get this kind of a graph with every set of library. The point is that if I take my set of positive controls shown in the green range, okay, how accurate is my docking? Are all the positive controls coming out together? And therefore, if these are here from the library that I've chosen, based on my positive controls, I could have a few molecules, in this example about 8 to 10 molecules, which actually bind better than my predicted or my positive controls. However, this evaluation should be done more systematically. So the first way is that, so I'm provided with GLIDE by the Drug Discovery Hackathon, and I modified it to also use Autodoc using my scripts. So now, can I actually score them together? Now, this is the enrichment plot, and I'll describe this, even though some of you may know it. But if we have the entire database of small molecules that we've used, in my example, I've used about 1,000 small molecules. And so this is the percentage of the ranked database. On the y-axis is the percentage of actives. So the active positive controls. Now this is the ideal case. Ideal case would be all my positive controls, all my known binding molecules would be in the top set of molecules. Okay, so if I have 10 molecules, rank number 0 to 10 would be positives, and then you would have decoys or negatives. So this is in the evaluation, the ideal case. This is a random case, and this is the enrichment plot. Now for consensus scoring, these are some software that we've used: Autodoc, Veena, Doc6. They are actually relatively ordinary in their results. They're nowhere close to this. The commercial software that we've had, which is Gold and Glide, are relatively well. Now, if we use methods where we combine the results of these software, some rank, some reciprocal rank, some score. Again, I'm not describing all these, but essentially I'll describe one of them. If I rank the results of each of this software, and then I just take the sum of these scores, then I get an improved score. So the sum rank is this particular black line. Now the black line doesn't seem to be better than Glide or Gold overall, does it? But if we zoom this portion, it comes out to be as good. And this is critical with virtual screening. If I've screened 1,000, then it doesn't make much of a point in saying that my top 10 molecules are much better, because we can actually tell an experimental facility to test 1,000 molecules. But if I've screened 10,000, if I've screened 1 million molecules, then the percentage from 1 to 10 is actually already in thousands of molecules. So really speaking, what we want is we want to have the early hits being very, very accurate. And you see that the early hits are extremely accurate with the sum rank. In fact, if this is zoomed, I'm sorry that we can't zoom it on this particular presentation, but if you zoom it, you will find that these are better than using the commercial software alone. So now that I've got a method that I can predict better scores with the earlier ones, I'd like to implement it as part of my protocol. The second method I'm going to talk about is that if we use a physical chemistry-based, equilibrium-based calculation based on free energy. Now, this was one of the initiatives that we had taken on as part of the open source drug discovery about 10 years ago. Could we rescore molecules using a molecular mechanics, Postma-Boltzmann surface area based method? Now, this is also part of what I'm talking about, which is coding. Now, this was published as part of in a journal called JCIM, Journal of Chemical Information and Modeling. It's been cited close to about 1,000 times. This is the official citation of about 900. Now see, what does it do? It takes two software. One is the APBS software, the other one is GROMACS. Now, if those of you are used to computational chemistry, these are very well-known software. Now, what it's done is simply taken this software and broken up the functions and put them together into a third software which we've released. Both of them are open source. So instead of taking programs, I have opened up a program and taken the functions and put them together to calculate, based on various parameters that we provided, the polar solvation energy, the non-polar solvation energy, and the molecular mechanics calculations to be able to give me the MM-PBSA calculations for the binding energy. Now, how do we do this? Or why do we do this? Why we do this is your normal calculation with Autodoc Vina, the enrichment. It's not too bad, but when we apply or rescore these with a simple minimization, the accuracy goes up enormously. Okay, we get nearly complete. Now, there are a few molecules which are always going to be problematic, so we are never going to get accuracies that are going to be ideal. But your accuracies go right up to about 90% of all actives using the PBSA method that we described. That is why it is cited so much. Now see, normal docking programs may stop with only the docking, steric, electrostatic if they're using force field based calculations. So if we want to add on the Boltzmann surface area calculation, or we add on parameters involving solvation, polar and non-polar solvation, then we can improve this. Now that was an improvement that comes from a knowledge of the theory, but I've developed code for it, and can we plug that code into our particular software? Okay, developing the software, this is the parameters that we did. You take the APBS GROMACS libraries and put them together, and this is the way that you can apply it. And this is what I described earlier. Now, what do we have? We have source code, which is either GROMACS or it is APBS, and we've taken out certain functions. Now, this is really a software design problem, but it's much, much easier than writing out the software from scratch, okay? And much of software development today is, even if you're developing a new software application, is reusing functions from other open source software. So these are two of the standard, GROMACS and APBS, and we put them together into this for GROMACS to use this calculation. And this is the way that software would be developed. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on this. I'm just mentioning it because this would involve knowing how to write software, and within a month's time, it may be beyond the scope of what we're going to do. But if we have existing applications and we can script them together, now that would be ideal because we use standard scripting tools like R, Python, Perl, or even Bash scripting tools to be able to put them together, and we will get our entire protocol in place. So what do we have? Now, this is a more involved flow chart. Again, for the purpose of today's talk, I won't necessarily have to go through everything because this describes what is the small scripts that you would write. So I'll just take a few of them. So I have my ligand library, and the coordinate space has to be transformed such that the ligand is now sitting in the active site. So I write a small script for doing that. Okay. Then the transformed library has to be prepared for use. In that case, what I was talking about is to be able to add in the charges and to be able to add hydrogen, solvation, etc., etc. For Autodoc, there is a script that does that. Similarly, the receptor also has to be prepared. We have to find out where the active site is, so we have an external application. Now, essentially what we do is we create a flow chart, and we are not writing out very much. We are just writing out scripts that either make small modifications in the coordinate space or are going to call external applications, use input data, and create output data. So these are what we call workflows as scripts. And this is a series of scripts which would be put together to generate the Autodoc results. Okay. So creating this kind of a workflow is the first stage. You first have your menu of tools that you need. You have your research problem statement that has already partly been defined, and you create this workflow. And then we have to move on to the next level of how we knit them together and use them in our particular research problem. Okay, so now that we've done with virtual screening, we have the second, ligand-based uses QSAR, and you have a hit over here. Now, honestly speaking, I will probably not deal too much with virtual screening because most of these workflows are available. Like I mentioned, Glide is being provided to most people who are using this. Autodoc is a very standard method, and they already have their pipelines in place. However, there is a lot of scope in using machine learning to develop new methods with new scoring. And so therefore, this is a more interesting focus when we are trying to develop scripts for drug discovery. So what do you need? You need your small molecule library. In this case, I'll use PubChem. For this, we need to calculate descriptors. Then we divide our molecules into training and test sets. We can do this using multiple training and test sets if we are using multi-cross validation. We generate models and we have ensemble classification. So this is the modification that we are making. If you're using something like support vector machines, that would be one method that we're using. But if we use multiple methods and I want to do an ensemble classification, this is the way that we will add them together. So we have an activity prediction. Okay. Now I'm going to standardize or get a protocol in place that we're going to use for chemoinformatics, predictive modeling and chemoinformatics. The first stage is to prepare or generate my data. Then we have to do pre-processing. Do we have unique entries, missing values? Are we going to remove correlated features? These are descriptors. Now, there are some features or descriptors which will be close to zero, and they just add to the calculations without adding any values, so we can think of removing them. There are other processes that are involved, such as centering your data, scaling your data to improve the variation, etc., etc. So this is dealing with the features and removing molecules or features that are important. Then you have, feature selection. And then we move on to model building. In the model building, what I want is I'm going to be able to split my data so that I can sample it. There are also the scope of what we call hyperparameter optimization, then cross-validation and the performance measures that we use for model building. After we have built our models, we need to predict it on the unseen data, so the set of molecules that we don't have. So this predictive modeling protocol, it will be based on the data, your activity for your training data, what is also called the response value, is known. So the molecule must either be active or inactive. Now the features or the predictions or attributes are the molecular descriptors. These describe structural and functional aspects of the molecule in numerical form. And the molecular descriptors are calculated by various open source or commercial packages. Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because I'm taking a standard machine learning classifier and applying it to chemicals. When I'm applying it to chemicals, it becomes a QSAR-based problem. And traditionally, before machine learning became very popular, we were doing QSAR, but we were traditionally doing it from a chemistry perspective. Partial least squares, for instance, comes from QSAR. It was used in chemistry, but it's now becomes quite standard. But now a lot of machine learning methods were developed with other things. Let's say image analysis. We can reapply them here. So the response value is activity. The features are descriptors, which are these, and they're calculated by various packages. Now, the one that I would strongly suggest is Paddle, but you also have molecules that are provided. You also have them provided from commercial. This is an open source, and it has about 700 to 800, maybe more descriptors available. Okay, so let's piece together our protocol. So if you take your data The data can be in various formats. It's the STF, the MOL format. It could also be in SMILES. We need to have a method to be able to take each chemical and calculate molecular descriptors so that we have a tabulated structure of the row containing the molecule and the columns containing the descriptors. Now this is a molecular library. The next step is the data cleaning. You can remove the redundancy. Then what I mentioned as pre-processing. So you could split the data over here into a training set and a test set. You could also, before that, we deal with missing values, zero variance, data splitting. Now these are really optional, but they come with tuning your method, and we'd like to have functions for doing all this. For instance, let's take the simple function of 0. If I read a column and I calculate the variation across the column and I find that that variation is close to 0. So what do I need to do? What I need to do is simply take the string of numbers that is there. It's a numerical function, and I want to calculate the standard deviation. And if the standard deviation is 0 or close to 0, then I have a near 0 variance. Then I can choose to remove that feature. Okay, so you could also use PCA for doing these kind of things. Now, you split your data such that you have a training set and a test set. Now, if I'm writing out my script for machine learning, I need to have a function for doing data splitting. So if I take my training set now and I do a second pre-processing if need be, this is again optional. And then we build the model on this. You have to resample, learning. These are various points that we would build in for this. Hyperparameter optimization, performance metric from this. The performance metric we'll mention. Model evaluation, model selection, and performance, from resampling and performance metrics overall, which are applied on this test set. Now, why have I listed all this together? Because if I'm writing out a script, I want to move sequentially from only given my raw data, which has labels, calculate the descriptors, which means that a molecule, a set of molecules, where every molecule is either active or inactive. So it becomes a two-class research problem, active or inactive. Then I can automatically run through all these processes and build a model of this using these scripts. So this therefore gives me my QSAR-based predictive model workflow that I've developed from scratch. Now, why do I want to do this? I want to do this because there are a large number of tools now which have excellent model building, but they may not be necessarily all ready for chemoinformatics. So if you have these kind of features, feature selection methods, I can simply use this section as a black box. For instance, scikit-learn from Python. R has a package called caret. Right? So most of them I can just put together if I can develop the entire script, and then we have a script with a model that is built, and I can then apply it to most of the problem statements that require QSAR. Okay, so this is my standard protocol. I'm going to freeze the standard protocol. My aim, therefore, is to develop software that can run as input only data which has the activity labels, and we have the output that comes together. Now, these are the tools that I would need. So there is paddle, descriptor. So it has up to 1,787 descriptors from this version of paddle. It may have improved over time. And I'm going to use R. And in the older version where we used to generate PDFs, we use Sweave as scripts to generate R. So we need to use the R package caret, which is the package for model building and machine learning, tech, which generates the PDF, and if we are scaling it for parallel computing, the OpenMPI or MPitch. I'm back to my protocol. I will not repeat it. So my aim is to develop scripts to implement the following that we have together over here. So I've just given you 3 different systems. The first is for virtual screening, where we have a number of applications. We have a menu of applications, and we want to put them together into a flow or a workflow. So we use a script or we have to write a script to do that. The second is that when we have some particular method which scientifically could improve an existing algorithm, and we want to develop the software. The third is using machine learning, where we have perhaps tools that are available for model building, but we need to pre-process them and use them for chemoinformatics, so we need to develop small scripts. Now, in future lectures that I'll develop, we will probably pick up one of these and use it as an example. I'll use the machine learning one if preferable, but we'll give about 2 weeks or 3 weeks for you to catch up with the other tools before we come back to this as a practical exercise. Okay, I've stopped at this stage. It may be actually shorter than what we are expecting, but you can ask me questions. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sir, thank you for your nice presentation. And I mean, these many lectures that we have heard about the theory behind molecular docking as well as virtual screening. So you have explained in such a way that how we can, I mean, the workflow, how it goes, and what are the packages, how we can integrate with the different packages. So you have given a nice overflow. Actually, we have a couple of questions in the YouTube channel as well as here in Microsoft Teams also. So one student, he is asking, what is genetic algorithm? You have mentioned about genetic algorithm. We just want to need the explanation of the genetic algorithm.
Okay, should I just talk about it because I don't have access to a whiteboard or a blackboard? So essentially a genetic algorithm is an optimization method, and it uses the principles of evolution. And the reason why it's called a genetic algorithm is that it uses principles called crossovers, and it uses a selection criteria called natural selection, where it uses a fitness function to select what is the best fit for a particular research problem. So it optimizes. With reference to what we are talking about, we want to be able to get the best pose or flexible pose. So essentially, if you take a small molecule, like let's say dichloroethane, let's say. So you have a rotation around a single bond, right? So you have an infinite number of rotations, but if you take only 360 possible rotations, you have the possibility of getting certain energy functions from each of that. So let's look at that as a fitness function, okay? So the simple plot that we will have is that you will have molecules at certain angles having high energy and certain angles having low energy. So if you generate a population of all possible molecules or poses, and then you start selecting which ones are best and rejecting those that are not, you will soon get a population that only has those that are made up of the low energy conformations. So the genetic algorithm is actually used very commonly in most of these because the application to torsions makes it easier to deal with flexibility.
Thank you, sir. And one more student, Anchal Mishra, he is asking why log P is important parameter in molecular docking.
Log P is not in molecular docking, but log P is downstream in testing out. It's a standard method of preclinical work in medicinal chemistry. So it's actually not important with docking. I had listed log P because for two reasons. The first is it is used experimentally, but it's also very easy to calculate, and it's very easy to therefore prove or use in different measurements. My aim in listing out those was that if we develop computational methods to replace the current experimental methods, we can save a lot of cost. And that has been the function that has been applied in the last 15 years. The improvement in toxicology predictions, simply toxicology predictions, have improved the throughput of molecules through the clinical trial stage by 40%, have improved the accuracy or reduced the failure rate by up to 40%. And that is a major step forward. It's a computational method based largely on machine learning.
Sir, one more student, Vijaya, she is asking how to calculate the strength of protein ligand interactions in terms of energy functions. Means like a hydrogen bond interaction, hydrophobic, van der Waals, or electrostatic interaction. So which will be the giving the most strength in terms of protein ligand interactions?
Okay. I'm sorry, Nagamani, I need to get back to the screen because I've lost it. Can you see me?
Sir, we are able to see you.
So which option on the left has the screen?
Sir, actually you have answered. Now
Okay.
we didn't.
No, have I unshared it? So, okay, fine. So the question was actually how do you evaluate the accuracy or how do you evaluate the scoring? So
like scoring, yes. Yeah, please
so
go ahead.
So essentially there is, in my presentation, I don't know whether the slides are available to everyone, but I can send them to you. There is a listing of various scoring functions. And scoring functions are actually an area of a lot of research because they could be, one of the easiest you would use if you understand physical chemistry would be a set of equations that we call force field based evaluation of the binding. The one that I described, which is more advanced, is to use solvation parameters, etc., etc. Again, that comes from a chemistry-based perspective. So the scoring function is essentially what you would in an algorithm call a fitness function. How do you evaluate it? And it can be described in most ways. The best and easiest that I would recommend is based on force fields, which are an evaluation of the molecular mechanics. And if you go beyond that into the solvation parameters that are for evaluating the binding affinity. Essentially, do you have a set of equations that can predict the active binding affinity of the complex? That would be the scoring function.
Thank you, sir. Actually, most of the students, they request you to give some hands-on session related to the lecture what you have given. So that is a request that so many students have put on.
Yeah, I'll plan on doing that, Nagamani. That's my purpose. This will be a series of lectures. That's why I said that number one will be introduction. But
yes.
we'll leave a little time because I want to see how many of the participants have a background in, let's say, medicinal chemistry or pharmacoinformatics and understand a little bit of coding. Okay, so then we can set the level of the tutorial at that level.
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you, sir. So that's all from our side. And we will join by 4 o'clock and for the vertical 2 session. And thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.